You can't understand the Middle East without understanding one moment. One quiet decision made behind closed doors. No cameras, no headlines, no global attention. Just two men, a map, and a pencil. Because over 100 years ago, long before the modern world took shape, two European powers sat down and divided a region they didn't even fully control. They didn't ask the people who lived there. They didn't consider history, culture, or identity. They simply drew lines, straight lines, and those lines would go on to shape the future of millions of people and define one of the most complex regions on Earth. That moment is known as the Sykes-Picot Agreement, and even today, its consequences are still unfolding. To understand why the Middle East feels so complicated, you have to go back before those borders existed. Back to a time when the region wasn't divided into the countries we recognize today. There was no Iraq, no Syria, no Jordan, no Lebanon. Instead, there was a vast empire, the Ottoman Empire. For more than 600 years, the Ottoman Empire controlled much of the Middle East, along with parts of Europe and North Africa. It wasn't a modern nation-state system. It didn't operate with clean, rigid borders. Instead, it governed diverse populations through a complex administrative system that allowed different religious and ethnic communities to coexist. Muslims, Christians, and Jews lived across the empire. Arabs, Turks, Kurds, Armenians, all part of a system that, while imperfect, provided a kind of long-term stability. People identified more with their local communities, tribes, and religious groups than with national borders, because those borders didn't really exist yet. But by the early 20th century, the Ottoman Empire was weakening. Internal struggles, economic decline, and external pressure from European powers were slowly eroding its control. Then came the event that changed everything. World War I. When the war broke out, the Ottoman Empire sided with Germany. That decision put it directly against Britain and France. And as the war intensified, it became increasingly clear that the Ottoman Empire might not survive. But instead of waiting for the war to end, Britain and France began planning the future of the region in advance. Not publicly, not transparently, but secretly. In 1916, representatives from both countries met to decide how they would divide the Middle East once the Ottoman Empire collapsed. Those representatives were Mark Sykes from Britain and François-Georges Picot from France. Together, they created a plan, a map, a blueprint for the future, the Sykes-Picot Agreement. And here's what makes it so important and so controversial. The borders they drew had almost nothing to do with the realities on the ground. They didn't follow tribal territories. They didn't respect religious divisions. They didn't consider centuries of history. Instead, they focused on strategic interests, control of land, access to resources, and political influence. France claimed control over regions that would eventually become Syria and Lebanon. Britain took control of areas that would later form Iraq and Jordan. And in doing so, they created entirely new countries. Countries that had never existed before, countries with borders that were, in many cases, completely artificial. This is where the complexity begins, because a nation is not just a piece of land. It's a shared identity, a sense of belonging, a common history. And in many of these newly created states, that foundation was weak or non-existent. Take Iraq as an example. When it was formed, it combined three very different regions of the former Ottoman Empire. Each region had its own identity, its own leadership structures, and its own religious and ethnic composition. There were Sunni Muslims, who had historically held power. Shia Muslims, who made up a majority but had less political influence, and Kurds, an ethnic group with their own language, culture, and aspirations for independence. These groups were brought together under a single national government, but they didn't necessarily see themselves as one unified nation. That created tension, and over time, that tension turned into instability. Political struggles, coups, conflicts, many of them rooted in those original divisions. A similar pattern can be seen in Syria, another country shaped by the Sykes-Picot Agreement. Here, multiple religious and ethnic groups were placed within one national framework. Alawites, Sunnis, Christians, Kurds, all part of a system that struggled to balance power. For decades, the government maintained control through force. But when that control weakened, the underlying tensions resurfaced and eventually exploded into conflict. Lebanon tells a slightly different story, but with similar roots. Its political system was designed to balance power between different religious groups, Christians, Sunni Muslims, Shia Muslims, all sharing authority. On paper, it seemed like a solution. In reality, it was fragile. And when that balance broke, the country descended into civil war. Again, the same theme appears: artificial borders, complex identities, unresolved tensions. Now here's where this history becomes directly relevant to the United States. Because after World War I, Britain and France didn't just draw these borders, they controlled the region. For years, these territories operated under European mandates, essentially a form of colonial rule. But eventually, independence movements gained strength. Countries became sovereign, and new governments took power, but the borders remained the same. The lines drawn in 1916 were still there, and so were the challenges built into them. By the mid-20th century, the United States began to take a more active role in the Middle East. At first, it was about influence. Then it became about strategy. Energy resources, especially oil, made the region critically important to the global economy. Shipping routes connected continents. Military positioning became a priority during the Cold War. And over time, the United States became deeply involved in the region's politics and security. But here's the problem. The U.S. didn't step into a stable system. It stepped into a region shaped by decades of artificial borders and historical tensions. That made every decision more complicated, every alliance more fragile, every conflict more difficult to resolve. Because nothing exists in isolation. A conflict in one country can affect neighboring countries. Religious divisions can cross borders. Ethnic groups can span multiple nations. What looks like a single issue is often part of a much larger system, and that system traces back, in part, to how the region was originally divided. That's why the Middle East can feel so confusing. Because it's not just about modern politics, it's about history that never fully settled. It's about borders that don't always match identities. It's about systems that were built quickly, but have had to endure for generations. Now imagine if the United States had been created the same way. Imagine if state lines ignored geography, culture, and population. Imagine if completely different regions were forced together, while others were split apart. It would be difficult to maintain unity, difficult to build trust, difficult to create stability. That's the situation many Middle Eastern countries have faced for over a century. And yet, despite all of this, it's important to recognize something. The region is not defined only by conflict. It is also defined by resilience, by cultures that have endured for thousands of years, by societies that continue to adapt and evolve. The story of the Middle East is not just one of division, it's one of survival. But the challenges are real, and they are deeply rooted. Because once borders are drawn, they are incredibly difficult to change, even if they don't work perfectly. Even if they create tension, changing them can lead to even more instability. So instead, countries manage the system they inherited. They navigate it. They struggle within it, and sometimes they are pushed to the breaking point. This is why the legacy of the Sykes-Picot Agreement still matters today. Not because it explains everything, but because it explains the foundation. It shows how the modern Middle East was shaped, how decisions made over a century ago continue to influence the present, and why the region remains one of the most complex in the world. For the United States, understanding this history is essential, because American foreign policy, military strategy, and global influence are all connected to what happens in this region. Energy markets, security alliances, counter-terrorism efforts, all of it is tied in some way to the Middle East. And without understanding its past, it's impossible to fully understand its present or predict its future. Because the truth is, the Middle East is not complicated by accident. It's complicated because of how it was created. A creation shaped by external powers, by strategic interests, by decisions made without local input. That doesn't mean the region is defined by those decisions alone, but it does mean those decisions set the stage. They created the structure within which everything else has unfolded. And more than a century later, the world is still dealing with the consequences. So the next time you hear about conflict in the Middle East, or see headlines about instability, remember this: it didn't start recently. It didn't begin with a single event. It began with a map, a pencil, and a decision that changed everything. And even today, those lines still exist, still shaping nations, still influencing conflicts, still defining one of the most important regions on Earth, because sometimes the most powerful decisions in history are not made on battlefields. They're made in quiet rooms, with simple tools and consequences that last for generations.